All right. It was an interesting question someone posed on my channel. And, I've talked about, using modelers, using digital effects, using analog effects, using tube amps, I've even used solid state amps. I've used every type of gear there is to, I don't know, get an electric guitar tone. And somebody asked, when do you use a tube amp? When do you use a modeler? And all of these things pose, important questions. And look, man, when you get a call for a gig, and, it's important to find out, stylistically, what are you going to play? Where are you playing at? How many people are going to be there? The size of the venue? How good is the PA system? All of these things factor into what you're going to use on the gig. Now, sometimes on certain gigs, they have certain restrictions, volume restrictions, amp restrictions. There's a whole side of the street in Nashville. If you're facing the river, I've heard that the right side of the street, a lot of those clubs do not allow an amp on stage. So no guitar amp. So I guess everybody that's playing in those clubs on that side of the street, they're having to use some kind of modeling or whatever. And I guess on the other side of the street where there's Roberts and Legends and Tootsies and all that, and I guess there's amps on stage. And so you've got two different worlds. Now, I've had some ridiculous comments on my page of people saying live bands are just too loud and you can't have a real drummer on stage. It's too loud and I can't enjoy my meal and all this. I said, look, man, there's 300 some stages in Nashville and probably let's guesstimate maybe 100 different drummers playing. And look, man, people are coming from all over the country and even all over the world to go to Nashville to hear a live band. So if you don't like loud drums and you don't like loud guitar and you want to just sit and enjoy your meal and be able to talk to people at your table, then Nashville's not the place to go. And don't go to any other places where there's live music and fine dining or crappy dining or whatever. I get it, man. Some people don't like live music and that's great. But man, apparently a ton of people do because Nashville is now packed every day of the week and even the slow season now, which used to be brutal. I think players are doing better now, even in the winter. Now, if there's a snowstorm or really bad weather, of course you're going to be affected by these kind of things. But man, there seems to be something going on in downtown Nashville all the time. So, man, there's people playing down there every night. And look, man, talking about volume, say, oh, a drummer can't play at a quiet volume. I know a lot of drummers in Nashville that do a lot of fine dining gigs. And most of them have no problem playing at whatever volume is needed. And these are acoustic drum kits. And you can certainly play with a lighter touch and you could use different types of sticks. You might use brushes some of the time. So the bottom line is this. There are plenty of musicians in Nashville on many different instruments that can play at a acceptable volume. There's a lot of drummers that can play quiet. And, depending on the gig, it's going to depend on whether you bring a tube amp or no amp or, whatever is involved. But let me give you some examples to where, if you're playing, say, a blues jam and there's other guitar players on stage and you're planning to show up with your modeler and have the sound guy at some random blues jam try to put you in the monitor and compete with the guy who might be blasting a half stack, or he might be blasting a super reverb or a twin reverb or something like that. That's the time when you're going to want to have a tube amp on stage. And look, if the other guitar player is cranking a twin, your deluxe reverb is going to get eaten for lunch. So there's a lot of factors involved here. Can a super reverb keep up with a twin? Yeah, I would say it probably could get close. A twin is a very loud amp. Super reverb though does have the 410 speakers and it's taller, so both of those amps would be fairly matched. Now, look, if you're playing a huge outdoor festival, outdoors, you've got a lot of open space. And if you've got a choice, I would say use a large tube amp, a twin reverb, or a half stack, or a boogie with a 212 cab or something like that. I mean, the thing that makes it expensive about being a guitar player is you are going to need the right tools for the job. Now, I'll do a little side note, and I've heard Guthrie Trapp talk about this, but if you're going to go into any situation where you're going to have to trade off with another guitar player or whatever, and you may be a Strat player that plays a Strat with 3 single coils, if you're competing against somebody that's got a guitar with humbuckers, that humbuckers are going to overdrive the amp more and are going to probably cut more. So if you're playing, if you're normally play a Strat with 3 single coil pickups, and you're going to a blues jam where there's going to be guys playing Les Pauls and 335s and stuff like that, maybe even a super Strat with a guitar that's got the 2 singles and a hum, you're going to find that your guitar is not going to cut through the mix as well. I mean, it is in some ways depending on the volume of your amp. But, it's like I would probably go into a situation with that with at least a Strat with a single humbucker in the rear. And that's going to allow you the best of both worlds. So when you want your squishy, clean sounds and your, squishy, overdriven, neck tone and stuff like that, you've got that. But if you need to cut through the mix of some guy that's cranking a Les Paul, you've got that bridge humbucker and you can overdrive your amp and do that. So this is really, this is a lot to unravel, but here's a situation, a big time situation where I've heard players talk about they absolutely had to use a modeler. If you're in a situation playing with a megastar, and I've heard Sean Tubbs talk about this, but playing with Carrie Underwood, and they would have all the amps and stuff like that off stage, and then they had a big, a stage for a certain tour, and it was basically said, hey, you're going to be away from your pedal board, you're going to be on platforms, and the platforms are going to rise and drop and all this kind of stuff. So we need you on some kind of like a fractal system that would be MIDI and switched by the house MIDI system. So all of your patch changes, all of your effects, all of that would be synced up to a MIDI, and you'll just be magically playing in all of your tones. It's kind of out of your control, but that's a situation where you have no other option but to use a modeler. And there may be many gigs like that, big time gigs, where they want a completely silent stage. And, that happens a lot. That could be a church gig. You could be playing a church gig and they want a silent stage except for your in-ear monitors. And in your in-ears, you could have your own mix and do that. So, there's a lot of different situations where you could use one or the other. The other equation is a solid state amp. And, towards the end of my run in Nashville, a lot of the corporate gigs and wedding gigs and stuff like that I was doing on weekends, and those gigs paid very well. It's a Nashville's become a destination wedding, and there be literally like probably 15 to 20 different weddings going on in town. So everybody's working. The prices go up. Your price goes up because, hey, if these guys don't pay you right, then you could go over to the other band. And so on those gigs, rather than haul a tube amp, I started bringing a solid state, a Quilter Aviator Mach 3, because it was a lot lighter, easier to carry in, and I never had to worry. I mean, I had gigs, and look, I'm a 58-year-old guy, so I had gigs where, man, I was having back trouble all week. And just the thought of lifting that tube amp into the trunk of my car and then pulling it out, I was worried I was going to tweak it. And it's like, look, because there's the other thing, man. Say you get to the gig and you're pulling that heavy twin or deluxe reverb or whatever you're using. For me, I was using a Dr. Z a lot, and pulling that out of the car, even though I've got like the light version of the amp, it's still heavy and it's awkward the way you've got to pull that out of there. And even though I would dolly it into the venue, you're still tweaking your back doing that. So I just didn't want to take that chance anymore because, man, if you do tweak your back extremely bad right before the gig, and then you've got to play the gig and you're up there in pain and all that. So I started using the solid state amp, and I prefer to have something behind me blowing some air, and then also be mic'd and put a little bit of the mic signal into the front, into my wedge, and of course it would be in the front of the house. But with the solid state amp, it had a simulated cab out with an XLR, and I would still be able to dial in and hear that XLR sound out of the the amp, out of the monitor in front of me. And I'd also have the combo amp pushing air behind me. Now, for clean tones, it sounded stellar. For overdriven stuff, I mean, it wasn't as good as the tube amp, but it was an option. It was an option. And because, frankly, it was so light, it was an option that I enjoyed bringing to the gigs. So I would recommend that if you're an older guy and you're looking for something lightweight that can crank. I mean, it will be plenty loud, and it's got a lot of different settings to kind of get your own thing. I ended up using the AC30, the top boost setting on it, and I'm not even a Vox guy, but that was the best clean sound that I was able to dial out of it. And I didn't use any of the limiting or any of that stuff on it, but I was able to get great tones. And I had people say, hey man, I love it when I hear that rig. It sounded great. So look, man, there's a lot of different situations, and you need to be able to be versatile with your setup. I've had times where guys say it's a really small stage. We don't have room for amps. I mean, I've literally been in spaces where I'm literally having to stand with my 2 feet in one spot because we've got 10 people jammed on a tiny postage stamp, seemingly sized stage. And in those instances, on my pedal board, I always had an HX stomp. So if I ever got to a gig and they're like, no amps, no amps, I've got it on the board, and all I got to do is set it for my, whatever Fender amp or whatever I would have in there to use as a pedal platform. And my pedal board was super small. It had a couple drives, a miniature wah, and the HX stomp, and that's it. But that was a super versatile option to have. So I've always had the ability to go direct if need be. What if you get to the gig and you do tweak your back and you don't even get the amp out of your car? Well, I'll limp in there with this pedal board and I'll play my gig. So there's a lot of different things to consider. And then that's what makes it so expensive to be a guitar player is you do have to have these different options covered. There are different, it's just like wearing different outfits. Different gigs, you got to wear different clothes. You need different guitars for different things. You're not going to show up with a flying V for a wedding gig necessarily, but maybe you get a call for a rock gig and you need some. I've had times where I thought, man, I really like to play like a really wild shaped guitar on a gig, and I don't usually keep those kind of guitars. I've had flying V's and stuff like that, but it's not something that I used a ton. So I don't keep them around. They don't end up staying very long. But as far as amps and when to use an amp, it really just depends on the situation. But I would say for your tube amp thing, have a lower wattage tube amp that you can use for quiet gigs, whether that be a Princeton with a 12-inch speaker in it or a deluxe reverb, right? And those would be your rigs for small, quieter type gigs, because volume can still be an issue, but you ultimately you still want to have your tube amp. So having an amp like that works really good for a situation like that. Having a higher powered tube amp for big outdoor gigs, big stages, recording sessions where you need a big sound, that would be the time you bring out the heavy iron, as they say it, because those amps have heavy transformers in them. They're a lot to carry. At least have a 212 cab. I used to always have a Mesa 212 cab that I could use if I needed to track something like that. And I've had 412 cabs over the years. I've gotten rid of all my 412s because I don't use that stuff anymore. But if I got to a point where I needed the big stuff, for bigger gigs, I would do that. I just really don't want to have to haul that stuff around anymore. But, having some kind of modeling solution in case the gig requires that, you don't have to spend a ton of money on that, but having the option, because you could have something like that on your board and just not use it unless it's an emergency situation. Your tube amp croaks. Hey man, I'm just going to run direct. And then you turn on your modeling pedal or whatever and treat that, put a clean amp on there. The thing about Nashville is most of us use amps as a platform for pedals. And so, I always would set for a clean Marshall or a clean Fender or something like that, and then still have my drive pedals on the board and still get, kind of close to what the sound that I was getting out of my tube amps. So there's not some drastic change in your tone. That's something to think about. If people, consistency is important, whether you're using a tube amp or a modeler or a solid state amp or whatever. People are going to expect and want you to have a consistently good tone. So you need to be able to understand, and studio guys talk about this, being able to make super quick adjustments, hearing your sound. And I've talked about this on the channel. Sometimes you literally have seconds to dial in your tone. And your amp and your rig, whether it's modeling, whatever, it's going to sound different in every room. And, don't make the mistake of putting so much low end in your sound. If you've got a bass player, as long as you're not playing gent or something like that, or thrash metal or something, you don't need all that low end. The sound guy, if he knows what he's doing, is probably going to roll all that stuff off. But man, be consistent. Get a good tone no matter what it is. So you're going to have to work on your sound just like you work on your chops. You're going to have to find the right pedals that work for you with the guitars that you use. And look, some pedals work great with single coils. Some pedals work great with humbuckers. Have a little bit of each on your board. So if you do go to that jam and you're going to be going up against a couple of Les Pauls, well, have a pedal that works great with a humbucker on your board in case you got to grab that Les Paul that you got to blow the dust off because you don't use it that much. It's a lot to think about. It's a lot to consider. And I probably only touched on some of the things that you need to think about in a situation like this. Look, man, I love tube amps, as much or more than anybody. And in a perfect world, I would use them 99.9% of the time. But man, sometimes, and when I'm at my house here, it's much easier, it's much quicker, and I can not disturb everyone in the house if I use a modeler. And that is another perfect time if you need to get good guitar sounds at home and you don't want to disturb your family and you don't have an ISO cab, like Tim Pierce in the garage downstairs, it's certainly fine to use a modeler and experiment with it, and when the folks leave the house or when the wife leaves the house or the kids leave the house, occasionally you can throw a mic on an amp and get some tones that way. That it's really a tough thing because guitar players are expected to cover all of this stuff. And I'm going to have to do a video in the future about how much all this stuff costs. It's not just having a cool guitar collection, it's having a collection of tools that can take those guitars and make them sound good. So it's a lot to think about. It's a lot to work on, but you'll find that the journey can be really rewarding when you get on stage and people go, man, your tone was awesome tonight. That makes it all worthwhile.